Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I do appreciate you being with me here on Now TV. You know, I'm hearing from more and more of you. Just recently, I made the comment, is anybody out there? Well, I began hearing from people who say, yes, we're out there, and we appreciate what you're doing. So thank you so very much for that response. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. Now, we are continuing our study of the challenge of Christ. Remember what that is. And I have to tell you this. Over the last couple of weeks, I have been accosted pretty severely by several people on YouTube and Facebook. Now, these are people who accuse me of being a heretic, a false teacher. I am doomed to hell. I'm leading thousands of people to hell, etc., etc. Well, the problem of it is, these are individuals who refuse to even consider the challenge of Christ. Just this morning, in response to 3 different, may I use the word, opponents, I posed the following challenge, and I just told them, you are attacking me for affirming that Christ kept his word. How ironic is that, folks? Okay, think about that. I am the one that is affirming that Christ kept his word. He did not fail. He did not lie. He did not deceive. And yet I'm the one being called a false teacher and a heretic. So, the challenge that I posed was this. You, as I was addressing these individuals who opposed fulfillment, I said, you serve a liar, a lunatic, or a deceiver. And I pointed out, Jesus said that no one was supposed to believe in him. Remember, John 10:37 and following, do not believe me for my word's sake, believe me for my works. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Now, folks, you ought to memorize this, right? As long as I've been with you, as many times as I've quoted it, you really ought to have this memorized. I mean, get it firmly embedded in your hearts and in your minds. So, I pointed out to these individuals, Jesus said, if he did not do the work that the Father had given him, no one's supposed to believe in him. And Jesus said, and I wrote this all out on YouTube and on Facebook, on different boards, Jesus said he was coming back in the lifetime of the first century generation with his angels in the judgment of all men. You, as I address these people, you do not believe he kept his word. So please explain to us, as I challenge them. Number one, did Jesus lie when he said he was coming back in that generation with the angels and the judgment? Did he lie? Number two, did he fail? Did Jesus say something, but then did not do it? Was unable to do it for whatever reason? Number three, was Jesus simply deluded? Well, if he was deluded, he was just another lunatic running around the country. There were a lot of those in the first century, folks. There were a lot of those who had been running around the Judean countryside. Herod the Great killed some of them all the way back before Christ was even born. Pilate killed some of them. In Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5, we are informed about some of those different lunatics running around saying that they were the Messiah and they were going to take the people down to the River Jordan and they were going to part the river and prove that they were God's chosen prophet. Well, Pilate heard about that, and he put them to death. So, I challenged these individuals. Now, actually, this has been going on for over a week. I challenged these individuals who are calling me a false teacher now, who are saying that even though I affirm that Jesus kept his word, and therefore we can believe in him, even though I'm the one that is affirming the faithfulness of Christ, I'm being called a heretic. And so when I pose this challenge to them, did Jesus lie? Number two, did Jesus fail? Number three, was Jesus simply a lunatic and was deluded? Do you know I've been posting that challenge? I have posted that challenge on no less than 3 different forums on both YouTube and on Facebook. Not one single one of these people who are calling me a heretic and a false teacher, not one of them have taken up the challenge of Christ and attempted to answer. Not one of them has been bold enough to say, no, Jesus didn't lie. Well, okay, if he didn't lie, then guess what? He said he was coming back in the lifetime of the first century people with the angels in the judgment of all men. So if he didn't lie, then that's what he said. And if he didn't lie, then he kept his word. Not one of these individuals calling me a heretic has been bold enough, courageous enough to step forward and to say, well, Jesus thought he was coming back, but he was deluded. So, they've not been bold enough to say that he did not lie. Now, they know, listen to me, folks, they know if they say Jesus did not lie, then they know that they are admitting that Jesus said he was coming back in the first century without fail, with the angels, and we could add in flaming fire. So they don't dare call him a liar because they know that's what the text says. But they say he didn't keep his word. So they're admitting, yes, that's what he said, but he didn't do it, therefore what? He's a liar. In the theology of these individuals. They know they're trapped, folks. I've got to tell you, they know absolutely 100% they are trapped. If they deny that that Jesus said those things, there's the wording of the text. If they deny that he kept his word, which is what they believe, then they call him a liar. If they say he failed to do what he said to do, they're calling him a false prophet. If they say he thought he was going to come back, but he didn't, then they're saying he was deluded. He was a lunatic. They are caught. They know they are caught. And listen to me very carefully, folks. This is the challenge of Christ. Jesus' words are too emphatic, too explicit, too repeated to deny that he said he was coming back in the first century. I mean, I'm sorry, there's just simply no way out of it. So we have a choice. And that choice and that challenge is presented to us not only by people who call themselves Christians, who claim to believe in the Lord, who claim to believe the Bible is inspired, and yet they sit back and say he did not keep his word. How do you claim to be a follower of Jesus? And listen, I say this kindly, because you see, for many years in my young preaching experience, I preached, here's Jesus' prediction, and I know he didn't come back, but that's okay. But you see, it's not okay. Listen, I was teaching a class on 2 Thessalonians at a congregation years ago. And we were talking about the language of Paul in which Paul said, we who are alive and remain will not precede those who are asleep. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 15 and verse 17. Paul was saying his generation was not going to pass away until the parousia. And one of my elders, one of the finest men I've ever known in my life, he loved the Lord. He loved the Word. And he raised his hand and he said, you know, Don, this language is really troubling. He said, anybody can see that Paul was saying the Lord was coming back in their lifetime. And he said, now, we know Jesus didn't come back. And he said, I've struggled with this for years. And I called his name and I said, brother, have you stopped to think about what you just said? That we know that Paul said Christ was coming back in that generation, but he didn't do it. I said, doesn't that make Paul a false teacher? And he said, that's what I'm bothered by. I don't know how to explain that. So I began to give some explanation for it, and he was very, very pleased. But listen, folks, I didn't realize how severe the challenge of Christ was for many years of my ministry. It wasn't until I realized I have to deal with this challenge because the enemies of Christ use it against us all the time. So what I've been sharing with you is how to meet the challenge of Christ. Here is the challenge. Here are Jesus' predictions. And yet we've been focused on 2 Peter chapter 3. And the reason we've been focused on this is because almost everyone says, well, okay, I see what you're saying there. But the reality is that Peter did say the earth and the elements are going to be burned up. That's talking about the end of time. That's talking about the destruction of the material cosmos. Well, okay, if 2 Peter 3 is about the destruction of the material cosmos, then that amplifies, magnifies the challenge of Christ. Was Peter talking about some other event than what Jesus said when he said the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works? Was Jesus' prediction something different from 2 Peter 3? And if a person says, as the huge majority of people do, if someone says, no, they're talking about the same thing, well, then we are faced with Matthew 16, verse 28, where Jesus said, verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming. That's the coming of the Son of Man of verse 27, his coming with the angels to reward every man, the coming of 2 Peter chapter 3. So, if you make 2 Peter chapter 3 to be the same coming as Matthew 16, 27, then the challenge of Christ is squarely in your lap. Because you know, and I know, the atheist, the Jew, the Muslim, they all know Jesus did not come back and put an end to material, physical creation in the lifetime of those people. That's why I've been sharing with you the Old Testament definition of the day of the Lord. We've been working ourselves through, to some degree, in depth, Isaiah chapters 2 through 5. We're in chapter 3. Last week, okay, for a couple of weeks now, I've been focused on Isaiah chapter 3. For the last 2 weeks, I've been focused on Isaiah chapter 3, verse 24 and 25. It shall be, the Lord said. Now remember, Isaiah is talking about the last days, the day of the Lord, when the Lord would come to shake the earth mightily. And by the way, I've got to digress here. In another YouTube discussion, had a man who claims to have been a preterist, and I guess he was, I don't know, I don't remember him, but nonetheless. And he's now calling me a heretic and a false teacher. I get that a lot. But you know what? I've got a real thick skin. But anyway, this individual said, you're drawing a comparison between Isaiah chapter 2 and 2 Peter chapter 3. But 2 Peter chapter 3 is about the destruction of heaven and earth, and Isaiah chapter 2 is simply when the Lord comes to shake the earth mightily, and the shaking of the earth is not the same as the destruction of heaven and earth. And as I've pointed out many times in that discussion, this is a gross ignorance of Hebraic apocalyptic language. It is imposing a journalistic rule on biblical text, rules that were absolutely unknown to the ancient Hebrews. And that rule is this. Well, you know, in order for Isaiah 2 to be parallel with 2 Peter chapter 3, then Peter, when he talks about the earth and the elements thereof being burned up, okay, so Peter's description of the coming of the Lord, the day of the Lord, must match verbatim, verbally, Isaiah chapter 2. So when Isaiah speaks about the coming of the Lord to shake the earth mightily, since he doesn't talk about explicitly and emphatically the earth and the elements that are therein being burned up, that must mean he's talking about something different. Folks, I got to tell you, this is horrible, horrible hermeneutic. So I challenged this individual, and oh, by the way, that was actually about two and a half weeks ago. I challenged this individual with consistency to see if he would stick by his hermeneutic, okay? And listen, I'm going over territory that's extremely important for us when we get back into Revelation chapter 6, which is where I'm trying to go right now, but I've just got so much to say. Okay, I pointed out to him, okay, you're saying because Isaiah 2 uses different terminology and leaves out some terminology that's found in 2 Peter chapter 3, then that means they must be the same. Must not be the same. They cannot be the same. I said, let's try that out, shall we? In Acts chapter 1, Jesus ascended into the clouds. And the angel of the Lord said, this same Jesus whom you see taken from you will come in like manner as you see him go. Now this individual who accused me of being a heretic, he believes that's the same coming that Peter describes in 2 Peter chapter 3. And yet Acts chapter 1 does not mention one word about the judgment of the ungodly that Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 9 mentions. Acts chapter 1 says not one word about the earth and the elements therein being burned up that Peter describes in 2 Peter chapter 3, 10 to 13. Acts chapter 1 says not one word about a new heaven and a new earth coming at the day of the Lord that Peter describes in 2 Peter 3, 13. Acts chapter 1 says not one word about resurrection. Oh, well, wait a minute. You know what? 2 Peter 3 doesn't mention one word about the resurrection either. So since 2 Peter 3 doesn't mention resurrection, Acts chapter 1 doesn't mention resurrection. Oh, but 1 Corinthians 15 does. Here's the conundrum for this young man, which I pointed out, and it's now been 2.5 weeks, and he hasn't hit not one stroke of a keyboard to answer. So I said, according to your hermeneutic, because certain words are missing, because different words are used, that they cannot be the same discussion, that means that since Acts 1 does not mention what 2 Peter 3 does, and since 2 Peter 3 does not mention one thing that 1 Corinthians chapter 15 does, and vice versa, because, after all, folks, 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't say one word about Christ's coming in like manner. 2 Peter chapter 3 does not use even a single word of Christ's coming in like manner. Now, again, as I pointed out to this young man, according to your hermeneutic, because we have different words used in these different contexts, because we have different words, different terms, different phrases used in each one of these contexts, they must be speaking of different events. Folks, do you see how absolutely absurd that hermeneutic is? So, again, I haven't heard from him. He hasn't typed one word in response. And you know what? He won't. Because he knows his hermeneutic is false. It is rotten to the foundation. Now, in Isaiah chapter 3, we have this prediction of the day of the Lord, verse 25, your men shall fall by the sword, your mighty men in the war. Now, as I pointed out last week, Jesus in Luke chapter 21 cites this verse in the verses that 99.9% of all commentators agree refers to the Lord's coming in AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem. Your men shall fall by the edge of the sword. Luke 21, verse 24. So, here we have Isaiah predicting the last days, day of the Lord, in which Israel's men would fall by the edge of the sword. In Luke 21, verses 20 through 26, we have Jesus talking about the impending fall of Jerusalem, which is the day of the Lord. His coming on the clouds, verse 25 and 26, which would be in the last days when Israel's men would fall by the edge of the sword. Where is the difference? Well, there is no difference. Okay. Then I shared with you that this motif that we find in Isaiah chapter 3, this prediction of the last days war, is one that is found and developed in the book of Revelation. Now, I'm not going to take the time that I have left, which isn't very much, to read again Revelation 6, 9 to 12. I'm only going to focus on verses 12 and following again, and I will read that, to remind us that the martyrs have cried out for vengeance. They've been told that it would come in only a little while. Verse 12 and following is the answer to their prayer. I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. Folks, this is Matthew 24, 29 to 31. This is Luke 21, 25 and following. This is common apocalyptic language. The stars of heaven fell to the earth, and the fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. Well, you see, this is using the language. It's not the same prediction, but it's using the language of the prediction of Isaiah chapter 34, which was a prediction of the destruction of Edom. The kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men. Now watch this. And every slave and every free man hid themselves in the caves and the rocks of the mountains. Now wait a minute. Isaiah predicted, remember this, Isaiah predicted that in the last days, the day of the Lord, when the Lord would arise to shake the earth mightily, the great men, the mighty men, would run to the hills, they'd run to the mountains, they'd hide in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and they would say to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath. What do you suppose this day of wrath is? The time of the war of Isaiah 3:25, when Israel's men would fall by the edge of the sword. But here's the key. Here's the absolute unget-overable aspect of this, ladies and gentlemen. Let me reiterate what I just said a moment ago. Let me drive this home. Isaiah 2 through 5, predicted the last days, day of the Lord, when the Lord would come to shake the earth mightily, when men would run to the hills. they would cry to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the day of the Lord. Here is John in Revelation citing verbatim from Isaiah 2, 19 to 21. Now, I have pointed this out before, but boy, oh boy, you got to catch the power of this. Remember, in Isaiah chapter 2, okay? In Isaiah chapter 2, I'm going to read it very, very quickly. They shall go into the holes of the rocks, into the caves of the earth. Now watch this. From the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth mightily. Remember? Remember, Paul quotes this verse verbatim from the terror of the Lord, from the presence of his glory, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. So Paul is drawing on Isaiah chapter 2. And remember that in Luke 23, 28 and following, Jesus said, the time is coming in which they're going to run to the hills. They're going to go try to hide, citing this verse. So we have Jesus citing these verses to appeal or to predict his coming in judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70. We have Paul quoting from these very verses to talk about the impending judgment of the Jews for persecuting the Christians, and that happened in AD 70. Now we have John in Revelation quoting from the exact, precise verse that Jesus applied to AD 70. Okay? So here is Isaiah predicting the last day of the Lord. When the Lord would come, men would run to the hills, cry to the rocks, fall on us. Jesus quoted from that verse and applied it to AD 70. Paul, talking about the impending judgment of those who were persecuting the saints, quoted this verse, said it'd be fulfilled in that judgment. Here is John quoting the exact same verse to predict the impending judgment of the persecutors of the saints. I'm out of time. I'll see you next week.